And welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more of Martin Luther King Jr.'s A Testament of Hope. This is going to be a long one, so I'll need you to just bear with me on this one. Let's hop into this. This one is called Love, Law, and Civil Disobedience. And the little forward to this says, this is a transcription of Dr. King's address before the annual meeting of the Fellowship of the Concerned on the 16th of November, 1961. This interracial fellowship was affiliated with the Southern Regional Council, which was formed in 1944 after D. Gordon Lane Hancock, a noted black Baptist pastor, journalist, and professor, wrote in an article titled Interracial Hypertension, in which he chided Southern liberals for their tolerance of racial bigotry and segregation. It succeeded the Commission of Interracial Cooperation, which was organized in 1919. They agreed to work to improve economic, civic, and racial conditions in the South and to retain, through research and action programs, the ideas and practices of equal opportunity. Under the leadership of stalwart white liberals such as Will Alexander, Howard Odom, and moderates such as Mrs. Jessie Daniel Ames, the commission provided a forum for progressives in the race question to discuss issues and devise strategies for challenging Southern segregation. But as Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, King's mentor and former president of Atlanta's Morehouse College, said, Negroes carried the ball in the movement. They had to continually prod this increasingly effective organization to be more aggressive. King and his staff knew that the source of many criticisms against the student sit-ins and freedom rides came from members of this group who preferred a more gradual approach. His task at the meeting was to persuade veteran white liberals at the invitation of Mrs. Dorothy Rogers Tilley to see the student movement as a natural outgrowth of their own work and of his own campaign. Miss Tilley was married to Milton E. Tilley, an Atlanta businessman, and was a former member of President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights. Members of the Fellowship of the Concerned of the Southern Regional Council, I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here today and to have the opportunity of being a little part of this very significant gathering. I certainly want to express my personal appreciation to Miss Tilley and members of the committee for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to express just a personal word of thanks and appreciation for your vital witness in this period of transition which we are facing in our Southland and in the nation. And I am sure that as a result of this genuine concern and your significant work in communities all across the South, we have a better South today, and I am sure we will have a better South tomorrow with your continued endeavor. And I do want to express my personal gratitude and appreciation to you, a fellowship of the concerned, for your significant work, and for your forthright witness. Now, I have been asked to talk about the philosophy behind the student movement. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that we confront a crisis in race relations in the United States. This crisis has been precipitated, on the one hand, by the determined resistance of reactionary forces in the South to the Supreme Court's decision in 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. And we know that at times this resistance has risen to ominous proportions. At times we find the legislative halls of the South ringing loud with such words as interposition and nullification. And all of these forces have developed into massive resistance. But we must say that the crisis has been precipitated, on the other hand, by the determination of hundreds and thousands and millions of Negro people to achieve freedom and human dignity. If the Negro stayed in his place and accepted discrimination and segregation, there would be no crisis. But the Negro has a sense of dignity, a new self-respect, and a new determination. He has re-evaluated his own intrinsic worth. Now, this new sense of dignity on the part of the Negro grows out of the same longing for freedom and human dignity on the part of the oppressed people all over the world. For we see it in Africa, we see it in Asia, and we see it all over the world. Now we must say that this struggle for freedom will not come to an automatic halt, for history reveals to us that once oppressed people rise up against that oppression, there is no stopping point short of full freedom. On the other hand, history reveals to us that those who oppose the movement for freedom are those who are in privileged positions, who very seldom give up their privileges without strong resistance. And they very seldom do it voluntarily. So the sense of struggle will continue. The question is, how will the struggle be waged? Now, there are three ways that oppressed people have generally dealt with their oppression. One way is the method of acquiescence, the method of surrender. That is, the individuals will somehow adjust themselves to oppression. They adjust themselves to discrimination or to segregation or colonialism or what have you. The other method that has been used in history is that of rising up against the oppressor without corroding hatred and physical violence. Now, of course, we know about this method in Western civilization because, in a sense, it has been the hallmark of its grandeur and the inseparable twin of Western materialism. But there is a weakness in this method because it ends up creating many more social problems than it solves. And I am convinced that if the Negro succumbs to the temptation of using violence in his struggle for freedom and justice, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness. and our chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. But there is another way, namely the way of nonviolent resistance. This method was populated in our generation by a little man from India whose name was Mohandas K. Gandhi. He used this method in a magnificent way to free his people from the economic exploitation and political domination inflicted upon them by a foreign power. This has been the method used by the student movement in the South and all over the United States. And naturally, whenever I talk about the student movement, I cannot be totally objective. I have to be somewhat subjective because of my great admiration for what the students have done. For in a real sense, they have taken our deep bones and passionate yearnings for freedom and filtered them in their own tender souls and fashioned them into a creative protest, which is an epic known all over our nation. As a result of their disciplined, nonviolent, yet courageous struggle, they have been able to do wonders in the South and in our nation. But this movement does have an underlying philosophy. It has certain ideas that are attached to it. It has certain philosophical precepts. These are the things that I would like to discuss for the few moments left. I would say that the first principle in the movement is the idea that means must be as pure as the end. This movement is based on the philosophy that ends and means must cohere. Now, this has been one of the long struggles in history. The whole idea of means and ends. Great philosophers have grappled with it, and sometimes they have merged with the idea, from Machiavelli on down, that the end justifies the means. There is a great system of thought in our world today, known as communism. And I think that without all the weaknesses and tragedies of communism, we find its great tragedy right here. And it goes under the philosophy that the end justifies the means that were used in the process. So we can read or we can hear the Lenins say that lying, deceit, or violence, that many of these things justify the ends of the classless society. This is where the student movement and the nonviolent movement that is taking place in our nation would break with communism and any other system that would argue that the end justifies the means. For in the long run, we must see that the end represents the means in process and the idea in the making. In other words, we cannot believe or we cannot go with the idea that the end justifies the means because the end is pre-existent in the means. So the idea of nonviolent resistance, the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, is the philosophy which says that the means must be as pure as the end. that in the long run of history, immoral, destructive means cannot bring about moral and constructive ends. There is another thing about this philosophy, this method of nonviolence, which is followed by the student movement. It says that those who adhere to or follow this philosophy must follow a consistent principle of non-injury. They must consistently refuse to inflict injury upon another. Sometimes you will read the literature of the student movement and see that as they are getting ready for the sit-in or stand-in, they will read something like this: if you are hit, do not hit back. If you are cursed, do not curse back. This is the whole idea, that the individual who is engaged in a nonviolent struggle must never inflict injury upon another. Now, this has been an external aspect, and it has an internal one. From the external point of view, it means that the individuals involved must avoid external physical violence. So they don't have guns, they don't retaliate with physical violence. If they are hit in the process, they avoid external physical violence at every point. But it also means they avoid internal violence of the spirit. This is why the love ethic stands so high in the student movement. We have a great deal of talk about love and nonviolence in this whole thrust. Now, when the students talk about love, certainly they're not talking about emotional bosh. They are not talking about merely a sentimental outpouring. They're talking something much deeper, and always have to stop and try to define the meaning of love in this context. But the Greek language comes to our aid in trying to deal with this. There are three words in the Greek language for love. One is the word eros. This is a beautiful type of love. It is an aesthetic love. Plato talks about it a great deal in his dialogue. The yearning of the soul for the realm of the divine. It has come to us to be a sort of romantic love, and so in a sense we have read about it and experienced it. We've read about it in all the beauties of literature. I guess in a sense, Edgar Allan Poe was talking about Eros when he talked about his beautiful Annabel Lee with the love surrounded by the halo of eternity. In a sense, Shakespeare was talking about Eros when he said love is not love which alters when its alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark. You know, I remember that because I used to quote it to this little lady when we were courting. That's Eros. The Greek language talks about philia, which was another level of love. It is an intimate affection between personal friends. It is reciprocal love. On this level, you love because you are loved. It is friendship. Then the Greek language comes out with another word, which is called the agape. Agape is more than romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is understanding, creative, redemptive, goodwill to all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. So that when one rises to love on this level, he loves men not because he likes them, not because their ways appeal to him, but he loves every man because God loves him. And he rises to the point of loving the person who does an evil deed while hating the deed that the person does. I think that this is what Jesus means when he said, love your enemies. I'm very happy that he didn't say, like your enemies, because it is pretty difficult to like some people. Like is sentimental, and it is pretty difficult to like someone bombing your home. It is pretty difficult to like somebody threatening your children. It is pretty difficult to like congressmen who spend all of the time trying to defeat civil rights. But Jesus says love them. And love is greater than like. Love is understanding, redemptive, creative, goodwill for all men. And it is this idea that is the whole ethic of love, which is the idea standing at the basis of the student movement. There is something else that one seeks to defeat the unjust system rather than individuals who are caught in that system. And that one goes on believing that somehow this is the important thing, to get rid of the evil system and not the individual who happens to be misguided, who happens to be misled, who was taught wrong. The thing to do is to get rid of the system and thereby create a moral balance within society. Another thing that stands at the center of this movement is another idea that suffering can be a most creative and powerful social force. Suffering has certain moral attributes involved, but it can be a powerful and creative social force. Now, it is very interesting at this point to notice that both violence and nonviolence agree that suffering can be a very powerful social force. But there is a difference. Violence says that suffering can be a powerful social force by inflicting the suffering on somebody else. So this is what we do in war. This is what we do in the whole violent thrust of the violent movement. It believes that you achieve some end by inflicting suffering on another. The non-violent say that suffering becomes a powerful social force when you willingly accept that violence on yourself, so that self-suffering stands at the center of the non-violent movement, and the individuals involved are able to suffer in a creative manner, feeling that unearned suffering is redemptive, and that suffering may serve to transform the social situation. Another thing in this movement is the idea that there is within human nature an amazing potential for goodness. There is within human nature something that can respond to goodness. I know somebody's liable to say that this is an unrealistic movement if it goes on believing that all people are good. Well, I didn't say that. I think the students are realistic enough to believe that there is a strange dichotomy of disturbing dualism within human nature. Many of the great philosophers and thinkers through the ages have seen this. It caused Ovid, the Latin poet, to say, "I see and approve the better things of life, but the evil things I do." It caused even St. Augustine to say, "Lord, make me pure, but not yet." So that in human nature. Plato, centuries ago, said the human personality is like a charioteer with two headstrong horses, each wanting to go in different directions, so that within our own individual lives we see this conflict, and certainly when we come to the collective life of man, we see a strange badness. But in spite of this, there is something in human nature that can respond to goodness, so that man is neither innately good nor is he innately bad. He has potentialities for both. So in this sense, Carlyle was right when he said that there are depths in man which go down to the lowest hell, and heights which reach the highest heaven. For are not both heaven and hell made out of him, everlasting miracle and mystery that he is? Man has the capacity to be good. Man has the capacity to be evil. And so the nonviolent resistor never lets this idea go, that there is something within human nature that can respond to goodness, so that a Jesus of Nazareth or a Mohandas Gandhi can appeal to human beings and appeal to that element of goodness within them. And a Hitler can appeal to the element of evil within them. But we must never forget that there is something within human nature that can respond to goodness, that man is not totally depraved. To put it in theological terms, the image of God is never totally gone. And so the individuals who believe in this movement and who believe in nonviolence and our struggle in the South somehow believe that even in the worst segregationist can become an integrationist. Now, sometimes it is hard to believe that this is what this movement says, and it believes it firmly, that there is something within human nature that can be changed, and this stands at the top of the whole philosophy of the student movement and the philosophy of nonviolence. It says something else. It says that it is much a moral obligation to refuse to cooperate with evil as it is to cooperate with good. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as the cooperation with good, so that the student movement is willing to stand up courageously in the idea of civil disobedience. Now, I think this is part of the student movement that is probably misunderstood more than anything else. And it is a difficult aspect because, on the one hand, the student should say, and I would say, and all the people who believe in civil rights would say, obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, and at the same time we would disobey certain laws that exist on statutes of the South today. This brings in the whole question of how can you be logically consistent when you advocate obeying some laws and disobeying other laws. Well, I think one would have to see the whole meaning of this movement at this point by seeing that the students recognize that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. And they would be the first to say, obey the just laws. They would be the first to say that men and women have a moral obligation to obey just and right laws. And they would go on to say that we must see that there are unjust laws. Now, the question comes into being, what is the difference? And who determines the difference? That is the difference between just and an unjust law. Well, a just law is a law that squares with a moral law. It is a law that squares with that which is right, so that any law that uplifts human personality is a just law, whereas that law which is out of harmony with moral is a law which does not square with moral law of the universe. It does not square with the law of God. So for that reason, it is unjust. And any law that degrades the human personality is an unjust law. Well, somebody says that does not mean anything to me. First, I don't believe in these abstract things called moral laws. And I'm not too religious, so I don't believe in the law of God. You have to get a little more concrete and more practical. What do you mean when you say that a law is unjust and a law is just? Well, I would go on to say in more concrete terms that an unjust law is a code that majority inflicts on the minority that is not binding on itself. So this becomes difference made legal. Another thing that we can say is that an unjust law is a code which the majority inflicts upon the minority, which the minority had no part in enacting or creating, because that minority had no right to vote in many instances, so that the legislative bodies that made these laws are not democratically elected. Who could ever say that the legislative body of Mississippi was democratically elected? Or the legislative body of Alabama was democratically elected? Or the legislative body even of Georgia has been democratically elected? When there are people in Terrell County and in other counties because of the color of their skin who cannot vote. They confront reprisals and threats and all of that. So an unjust law is a law that individuals did not have a part in creating or enacting because they were denied the right to vote. Now, the same token of just law would be just the opposite. A just law becomes sameness made legal. It is a code that the majority, who happens to believe in that code, compel the minority who don't believe in it to follow because they are willing to follow it themselves. So it is sameness made legal. Therefore, the individuals who stand up on the basis of civil disobedience realize that they are following something that says that there are just laws and there are unjust laws. Now they are not anarchists. They believe that there are laws which must be followed. They do not seek to defy law. They do not seek to evade the law. For many individuals who would call themselves segregationists and who would hold on to segregation at any cost seek to defy the law, they seek to evade the law, and their process can lead on into anarchy. They seek in the final analysis to follow a way of uncivil disobedience, not civil disobedience. And I submit that the individual who disobeys the law, whose conscience tells him it is unjust, and who is willing to accept the penalty by staying in jail until the law is altered, is expressing at the moment the very highest respect for law. That is what the students have followed in their movement. Of course, there is nothing new about this. They feel that they are in good company, and right so. We go back and read the Apology and the Credo, and you see Socrates practicing civil disobedience. And to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner, to a point where they were willing to be thrown to the lions. They were willing to face all kinds of suffering in order to stand up for what they knew was right, even though they knew it was against the laws of the Roman Empire. We could come up to our own day, and we see it in many instances. We must never forget that everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in the days of Hitler's Germany. But I believe that if I had the same attitude then as I have now, I would publicly aid and comfort my Jewish brothers in Germany if Hitler were alive today, calling this an illegal process. If I lived in South Africa today, in the midst of the white supremacy law in South Africa, I would join Chief Luthuli and others in saying break these unjust laws. And even let us come up to America. Our nation, in a sense, came into being through a massive act of civil disobedience. For the Boston Tea Party was nothing but a massive act of civil disobedience. Those who stood up against the slave laws, the abolitionists, by and large, practiced civil disobedience. So I think these students are in good company, and they feel that by practicing civil disobedience, they are in line with men and women through the ages who have stood up for something that is morally right. Now, there are one or two other things that I want to say about this student movement. Moving out of the philosophy of nonviolence, something about what it is a revolt against. On the one hand, it is a revolt against the negative peace that has encompassed the South for many years. I remember when I was in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the white citizens came to me one day and said, and I think he was very sincere about this, that in Montgomery, for all these years, we have been such a peaceful community. We have had so much harmony in race relations. And then you people have started this movement, boycott, and it has done so much to disturb race relations. And we just don't love the Negro like we used to love them, because you have destroyed the harmony and the peace that we once had in race relations. And I said to him, in the best way I could say, and I tried to say it in a nonviolent way, we have never had peace in Montgomery, Alabama. We have never had peace in the South. We have had a negative peace, which is merely the absence of tension. We've had a negative peace in which the Negro patiently accepted his situation and his plight. But we've never had true peace. We've never had positive peace. And what we're seeking now is to develop this positive peace. For we must come to see that peace is not merely the absence of some negative force. It is the presence of a positive force. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, but is the presence of justice and brotherhood. I think this is what Jesus meant when he said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. Now, Jesus didn't mean he came to start war, to bring a physical sword, and he didn't mean I came not to bring positive peace. But I think what Jesus was saying in substance was this, that I come not to bring an old negative peace, which makes for stagnant passivity and deadening complacency. I come to bring something different. And whenever I come, a conflict is precipitated between the old and the new. Whenever I come, a struggle takes place between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. I come not to bring a negative peace, but a positive peace, which is brotherhood, which is justice, which is the kingdom of God. And I think this is what we are seeking to do today. And this movement is a revolt against a negative peace and a struggle to bring into being a positive peace, which makes for true brotherhood, true integration, true person-to-person relationships. This movement is also a revolt against what is often called tokenism. Here again, many people do not understand this. They feel that in this struggle, the Negro will be satisfied with tokens of integration. Just a few students and a few schools here and there, and a few doors open here and there. But this isn't the meaning of the movement, and I think that honestly impels me admit it everywhere I have an opportunity, that the Negro's aim is to bring about complete integration in American life. And he has come to see that token integration is little more than token democracy, which ends up with many new evasive schemes, and it ends up with new discrimination covered up with such niceties of complexity. It is very interesting to discover that the movement has thrived in many communities that had token integration. So this reveals that the movement is based on a principle that integration must become real and complete, not just token integration. It is also a revolt against what I often call the myth of time. We hear this quite often, that only time can solve this problem. That if we will only be patient and only pray, which we must do, we must be patient and we must pray. But there are those who say, just do these things and wait for time, and time will solve the problem. Well, the people who argue this do not themselves realize that time is neutral, that it can be used constructively or destructively. At points, the people of ill will, the segregationists, have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. So individuals in the struggle must come to realize that it is necessary to aid time, that without this kind of aid, time itself will become an ally of the insurgent and primitive forces of social stagnation. Therefore, this movement is a revolt against the myth of time. There is a final thing that I would like to say to you. This movement is a movement based on faith in the future. It is a movement based on a philosophy, a possibility of the future bringing into being something real and meaningful. It is a movement based on hope. I think this is very important. The students have developed a theme song for their movement. Maybe you've heard it. It goes something like this. We shall overcome deep in my heart. I do believe we shall overcome. And then they go on to say another verse. We are not afraid. We're not afraid today. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. So it is out of this deep faith in the future that they are able to move out and adjourn the councils of despair and to bring new light in the dark chambers of pessimism. I can remember the times that we've seen together. I remember that night in Montgomery, Alabama, when we had stayed up all night discussing the freedom rides. And that morning came to see that it was necessary to go on with the freedom rides. That we would not, in all good conscience, call an end to the freedom rides at that point. And I remember the first group got ready to leave, to take a bus for Jackson, Mississippi. We all joined hands and started singing together. We shall overcome, we shall overcome. And singing within Me said, now, how is it that these students can sing this? They are going down to Mississippi. They are going to face hostile and jeering mobs, and yet they could sing, "We shall overcome." They may even face physical death, and yet they sing, "We shall overcome." Most of them realized that they would be thrown into jail, and yet they could sing, "We shall overcome. We're not afraid." Then something caused me to see at that moment the real meaning of the movement. That student had faith in the future. The movement was based on hope. That this movement had something within it that says somehow, even though the arc of moral universe is long, it bends towards justice. And I think this should be a challenge to all others who are struggling to transform the dangling discords of our Southland into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. There is something in this student movement which says to us that we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, some may have to get scarred up, but we shall overcome. Before the victory of brotherhood is achieved, some will maybe face physical death, but we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, some will lose jobs, some will be called communists and Reds, merely because they believe in brotherhood. Some will be dismissed as dangerous rabble-rousers and agitators, merely because they're standing up for what is right. But we shall overcome. That is the basis of this movement. And as I like to say, there is something in this universe that justifies Carlyle in saying, "No lie can live forever." We shall overcome because there is something in this universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, "Truth, crushed to earth, shall win again." We shall overcome because there is something in this universe that justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne." Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. With this faith in the future, with this determined struggle, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. Thank you. Okay, and at the bottom, there is a footnote that reads, Magazine, New South, December of 1961, 3FF. A version of this address was reprinted on Philip S. Spawner's edition of Black America, The Voice of Black America. Major speakers by Negroes in the United States, 1797 to 1971. The philosophy of the student nonviolent movement. Further information about Mrs. Dorothy Rogers Tilley can be found in John Patrick McDowell's The Social Gospel in the South, the Woman's Home Mission Movement in the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, 1886 to 1939. And then further discussions of the work of the Southern Regional Council can be found in Benjamin E. May's Born to Rebel, an autobiography, and in Raymond Gavin's The Perils and Prospects of Southern Leadership, Gordon Blaine Hancock. So, just providing a list of reading material that also discusses what King discussed. Now, that was a long one. Let's go over this. All right. In it, King wants to talk about how he feels the student movement is so important and convince the group he's talking to. The Southern... Sorry, what was their name again? Something of concern. Bear with me a moment. Fellowship of the Concerned. So he's trying to tell them, how important this student movement is. How much they put themselves into the movement to push to get it to advance. And of course he continues discussing how he feels nonviolence is so important as a philosophy. And of course he discusses how... Well, he discusses quite a bit, actually, about his influences. Being a preacher, of course, he's influenced by Jesus. And his idea for nonviolence came from Gandhi. But he's also, you can tell Dr. King is well read because he discusses a number of philosophers and thinkers. In that section alone, he discusses people like Machiavelli, Socrates, Plato. So yeah, you could tell he was a well-read man. But he compares much of what they even say in distinguishing why you must not give in to the want to be violent. And again, he also speaks of the Greek love of agape, understanding each other. So, he really wants to press this idea. Which I agree with him. It makes sense. Let's see, what else have we got? He talks about the Supreme Court decision of 1954, which I believe is Brown versus the Board of Education, if my memory serves right. And he mentions that while he talks about just and unjust laws. And he talks about this at quite great length. He says legality does not make something moral. And he gives the great point of Hitler making it illegal to provide aid and comfort to the Jewish people in Germany. While that was technically legal to, no, don't provide them aid, it wasn't just, it wasn't moral. So he uses that point. And I think it's a really powerful point. There are brief mentions of communism, because you also got to remember this is taking place in the 1950s. 1950s, 1960s. Let me see when the actual speech was. 1961. So, the Red Scare was kind of on the tail end, but we're still in the depths of the Cold War at some of its worst points. So yeah, there's a lot of fear-mongering, which, personally, don't get me wrong, communism is not a great thing. Socialism's fine, though. And I think a lot of people have issues where they conflate the two. Communism is not socialism. Well, it's true. It's not completely socialism. Socialism is the idea of gathering together your resources and doling it out fairly, those who are in need, maybe help them a little more. Meanwhile, communism is you gather up your resources and then you have a central force who says, I think this is all you deserve. Like it, accept it. So in a way, it's a far more extreme form of socialism. But socialism in itself, not bad. It's not an evil thing. But yeah, communism could be very corrupted. But anyway, let's move along here. Um, he talks about he mentions one specific part about Montgomery, Alabama, where he spoke to this white person, and they said and King says, I think they meant this honestly, but the white person says, we had peace in our race relations. We had no problems. Everybody was in harmony in the community and everything. Until you came down here with your boycotts and your protests. And, trying to claim that it's because of Dr. King and the student movement that the race relations are in shambles, instead of realizing that no, there is a whole history here leading up to it not being equality, but simply because there's not violence, they think that it's fine, it's harmony, it's okay. Which is kind of similar to today. The protests against the police departments to defund them is still going on. And a lot of people are like, this is just violence, it's just rabble rousing, da 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 da. And it's like, no, people are protesting for a reason. And I even make this comparison. And Dr. King uses this, so I feel even better about it. It was protesting when they threw the tea the British had into Boston Harbor. So, not all property destruction is violence. Now, do I feel there should be some places set alight on fire and things? No, that's not right. But if there is some destruction of property or so on, some vandalism, that's fine. You should expect that. But yeah, when you get to burning down places and stuff, no, that's not right. But again, some vandalism, some property destruction, that's just part of nonviolent resistance. Even Dr. King himself points this out. Yet today we're so hung up on it's property, it's someone else's property. I feel like I was saying, some of the vandalism, like tagging stuff, um, some of that is necessary. It can be seen as necessary as fine. That's just part of explaining what's going on. The Berlin Wall. You don't think they wanted to keep that clean? But no, people spray painted it. And yeah. But anyway, what else is in here that we kind of want to go over? Oh yeah, right here at the end, we start hearing some of the things that even if you've not heard a full speech or anything, you are likely to have heard before when it comes to the civil rights movement. Where is the line? Uh, I can't find it, but essentially it goes, even though the arc of justice is long, it bends towards. It may have been not, it bends towards justice, or the arc of time is long. It bends towards justice, or something like that. That's a line you often hear when it comes to the civil rights. I can't find it because my memory sucks. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, and the other thing you often hear is "we shall overcome," and he mentions that as part of part of a song for the student movement. which I was not aware that's how that started. So that's interesting to find out. I shall not be afraid, and we shall not be afraid, and we shall overcome. So yeah. But that's it for now. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.